Loud. Yes. All right, everybody. Well, re-welcome to this stack seminar on diversity, climate, trust, and turnover intentions, a multi-level dynamic system by Ward, Beal, Zyphur, Zhang, and Bobko. That's forthcoming in Journal of Applied Psychology. And I'll be serving as your moderator today. And then we're fortunate to have AK as the presenting author here. And then David Dwertman is going to extend those ideas within the discipline. And then Oscar Holmes is going to talk about some broader extensions of the paper into other disciplinary areas. And then Anthony Hood is going to give us a practical perspective. Once we've finished this up, we will then post the recording on our website at the address shown there. So let's start with the basic question for the panel, beginning with AK, which is, what problem are we actually dealing with in this paper, and why should we care about that particular problem?
It's actually dealing with a lot of problems. It should have been 2 papers, if not 3 papers, because this paper deals with so much. First of all, we don't know a lot about how supportive climates for diversity and inclusion form. We know they're good. We know you want them, but we don't know how to get there. So one of the things we were looking at is the relationship between your trust in your department and your diversity climate perceptions within it. We're looking at that relationship. In past research, we just have correlations. We know they're correlated, but we don't really understand that relationship. Is trust an antecedent of diversity climate? We don't really know. We also don't know what happens over the long term, because the research on this relationship is at a snapshot in time. So does it really matter if they're related? Does it affect things in the future? So that's one issue. Another issue is context. Does that relationship hold in every context in every department? And I'll talk more about that later. But from a practical perspective, this is super important, again, for that how do we build diversity climates issue, but also because so many companies end up wasting time and effort and money on diversity initiatives that either have no effect, they don't work, or they backfire, they explode. Lisa Leslie wrote this great AMR, Academy of Management Review paper a few years back on the unintended consequences of diversity initiatives. And our paper helps explain a little bit of that, because one of the things we found is that in these departments where the diversity climate is generally bad, it's not supportive, then trust and diversity climate they have this reciprocal relationship. If you don't trust your leaders already, and you try to implement some diversity initiatives, it's going to blow up on you, because they'll think, oh, these folks, they're only doing it to talk the talk, to check the box, or we don't trust them to do it well, or it's actually going to just have a negative impact on me. And so, so from a practical perspective, yeah, it helps address that a little bit.
All right, thank you. David, could you tell us a bit more about why this is an important question?
Sure, absolutely. And first of all, thanks for having me, Mike, and thanks for organizing this. And congrats, AK, on the paper. I fully agree with you, AK. This could have been probably split up in at least 2 different papers. There was a lot to digest in terms of different analyses over time, multi-level, interplay of different aspects. So for me, I guess I would just re-emphasize what you said in your second point. I really think, to me, the most interesting part of this paper is this interplay between, on the one hand, between department or between unit diversity climate and the within one, and the way you operationalize the within one, particularly in terms of the different score of the individual relative to the people. Because what we know is that particularly, or what we assume in the literature, actually, there's not that much empirical research on this, but is that particularly minority group members traditionally tend to be, on the one hand, they value diversity things more, which makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, they're also more critical of things that are happening in terms of diversity, right? So we could see often that because they're often underrepresented, lower amount of people or percentages in teams, that basically their scores are kind of washed out by like the average of like a diversity measure, right? So traditionally the literature has only looked at individuals or teams, and I think this is the first paper that really tries to look at both in combination and tries to disentangle some of these mechanisms that link then the 2 different facets to outcomes. So for me, that was probably the biggest issue that this paper has addressed.
All right, thanks. So we're starting to muddle a lot of the questions together. So I want to, as much as I can, try and stick to the original question, and then we'll draw in more depth on each of those additional points about what this paper does and how it addresses that problem and so forth. But what is the underlying problem? Oscar, could you clarify that a bit more? Maybe looking at it beyond just the scope of this discipline, but You know, why are we writing this paper? What are we trying to deal with in the first place? Not what did we have in the paper and so forth.
Well, again, thank you, Mike, for the invitation, and AK, congrats as well. And I think my colleagues, AK and David, have really brilliantly answered the question. So the only thing that I will add to what they previously said is, you know, what this paper did is important from the standpoint when we think about numbers and quantitative research. And a lot of people in our field think about quantitative research as the holy grail, right? But what AK and her co-authors have brilliantly shown, and I really love the example that they gave to highlight, you know, the difference between, I think they used Maria and Martin. So even if they had the same quantitative number, right, in a study, if you don't take into account both the within and between group differences, then the numbers that we get in the end, we won't be able to accurately interpret those numbers. So particularly when it comes to diversity climate, we must, which they're trying to argue, right? We must consider, you know, if not empirically tested in all of our research, we must consider how our quantitative numbers may not show us or tell us what we think they're actually telling us.
All right, valid point. So you're taking it from more of a methodological angle. I wonder, Anthony, from a practical perspective, I'm just trying to get at, you know, what is it that we're trying to address here? Is it, you know, how to build trust in an organization? Is it how to make diversity programs more effective? Or what do you think is really kind of the underlying issue here that this paper is tackling?
Yeah, I love the way, you know, AK, you know, brought up the literature on do diversity programs work. They do work, but there's certainly a lot of boundary conditions, and trust is one of those things. And so there's probably a lot of groundwork that needs to be done to make these diversity efforts effective. You know, in a lot of organizations, I hear leaders talk a lot about culture. I don't hear a lot of conversation about climate. And I love how you are bringing out that there are all these different subclimates that exist within and across organizations. And so I think from a practical standpoint, really kind of going down to functional levels, to teams, and recognizing that there are different climates throughout and different levels of trust. And then how does this impact turnover intentions? And one of the things I was thinking about is, sure, there's turnover, people thinking about leaving the organization, but sometimes people just want to leave their leader and maybe go to a different unit within the organization. They love the company, they just hate their teammates. So, you know, that's another aspect that I was thinking about is, you know, turnover intentions move into a different department that may have a much more supportive diversity climate and more trust.
All right, thank you. So no matter what we are taking as given as the underlying question, and you've all approached it from a somewhat different angle, which is interesting. What is it that you think is missing from understanding of that problem in the existing literature, right? So if it's about turnover intentions, if it's about diversity program management, if it's about, you know, trust in organizations or whatever, within those literatures, these are not novel questions. It's something else has been missing though from these otherwise extensive literature. So maybe if we could, we'll start maybe with David on this one.
Sure. So I'm trying to stick to my role as disciplinary discussion. So from the diversity climate literature, again, really I'm going back to this, looking at not only the team level, the average level of diversity climate and how that impacts outcomes such as trust and then ultimately turnover tensions here, but also looking at the individual and particularly the relationship between the individual and their team members. Right, so climate very often is being seen as more of a unit level kind of, the idea is that you develop a shared understanding, but is that actually the case? And we know from some literature that that is not the case, right? Like often people look at it at the individual level because there is a relevant case to be made that it's important what the individual thinks, not just what team members think, right? Anthony mentioned to the fact that maybe individual people want to leave their team, but want to move to a different team, right? And that's maybe because they don't find that that perception that they match with their colleagues. And that's something that AK and co-authors also brought out in their paper, that if there's this gap, then maybe you feel like you don't fit in, right? And that makes you want to leave. So that's really something that, again, I think prior literature has not been able to get at, certainly not to this extent. And part of that is the strong data set that they've collected here, which is impressive, certainly. So I think looking at both of those and how both of those simultaneously impact trust, how trust forms, and also how trust impacts those relationships, and then ultimately turnover tensions. I think that's something that has been lacking from the literature so far, at least the diversity climate literature.
Great, thank you. AK, would you agree, or was there a different sort of gap that you had in mind?
Yeah, so I think the gap is it's so hard to get the data sets that you need to test this. So both Oscar and David have talked in their published work about this levels issue. It's either psychological diversity climate from the individual level, and then there's this argument, is that really climate? Because climate is a shared thing. And then, you know, who gets left out at when you aggregate it to the group level. And so that is a huge problem. And people normally, it's not that people don't want to address it. It's not that people are ignorant of that issue. It's that you can't test it because you don't have the data for it. So so we were really, really fortunate to have that data. So so that the large data set allowed us to be able to do that. But then also the analytical tools haven't been there before. This is, to our knowledge, the first multi-level cross-legged panel model that's ever existed. So I was telling y'all before we hit record that that I came to Dan with these ideas of, well, this needs to be tested longitudinally, but also in a multi-level context. So run this model. He says, well, that model doesn't, I mean, you can't, we don't have the analytical tools to do that. And so Michael Zyphur had to come up with it. He had to develop them himself. So anyway, so those have been some things, the levels issue in particular, but also the longitudinal issue over time, what happens to these things. So most people can't get the data sets over time, and most people can't get that multi-level data. We were very, very lucky.
Okay, yeah, that's also, Oscar, you were pointing that out earlier, that I think there's a big methodological contribution here. And then you've done a review of this as well. So, you know, some sort of the underlying theoretical. Are there some questions here theoretically as well that were underexplored in the literature?
Yeah, absolutely. And AK brought it up earlier, and I think we don't pay enough attention to it. And that's the question of the antecedents of diversity climate. And it's really, having published in this literature, it's really difficult for reviewers and editors to want to accept articles where you actually deal with the antecedents of diversity climate, because it's such an assumption, like, oh, we know those things. And what AK and her co-authors were able to do was empirically test at least one of those antecedents with trust and look at it in a reciprocal format. But I think, you know, we need to do much more and accept that we need to not just assume what are these antecedents to diversity climate. You know, for example, people will say, well, okay, human resource practices, inclusive human resource practices, right? But again, when you look at how many articles actually test those antecedents to diversity climate, you won't find many. And in fact, my diversity climate meta-analysis actually started off with trying to test those antecedents, but the model completely changed through the review process afterwards, where we dropped even that attempt off, right? And so I reading this, I was like, this is brilliant. The fact that AK found a way to test at least one of those antecedents of diversity climate in a really impactful way. And hopefully throughout this conversation, again, more reviewers and editors will realize that it's important for us to empirically know these things and not just think about, like, our assumptions go based on our intuition of what we think actually drive diversity climate.
Great. So antecedents, levels, you know, methods, all that data access and so forth from the academic side is missing. But, you know, extending beyond that, Anthony, from a practical perspective as well, what else has been missing from our understanding of this area?
I think that's it as well. Like, you know, if I were to go and talk to my leaders about this, you know, they'd be like, that's great. How do we change it? Mm-hmm. And that's a conversation about antecedents. So they're going to say, what do I need to do today? What investments do we need to make in order to make sure that we have a really good climate for diversity? And then how does that then impact our culture? And one of the things I'll probably talk about in another later on this webinar is, you know, the business case. Because oftentimes, you know, leaders want to know, how does this help us make more money or reduce costs or impact retention, productivity, efficiency, all these other different aspects. So I think tying, diversity, climate, and trust, and even turnover to a business case, I think would provide a lot of value.
That's a great point. Let me pull up the next.
Mike, if I may jump in very
Yeah, go
quickly,
ahead.
related to both of these comments, particularly also Oscar's, I think one of the problems is that people are sometimes not very clear about what is diversity climate and what is not, right? They perceive, for example, supportive HR practices as part of the climate. So because of that, it's very hard to publish a paper that says like, no, this should actually be an antecedent of diversity climate that leads to certain perceptions. And that's really hard to come across reviewers and editors who are knowledgeable enough and are accepting of these ideas. But I do agree that that's very important. I'm also in line with what Anthony just pointed out.
Excellent point. So moving, tying this now to the third question, and we've gotten to some of this already, but, thinking this through, and let's stick with Anthony then. How has this paper improved understanding of, say, the business case or antecedents or other applied things that, they want to know in the organization?
Yeah, I think from a practitioner standpoint, they would probably see these diversity, climate, perceptions, and trust as one and the same. And clearly they are not. And so we have to address them differently because they're going to have different antecedents and I think probably lead to, slightly different outcomes. So I think from a practical standpoint, I would be interested in understanding how do we, drive better climate perceptions and what are the things that are going to impact trust. And then I'm also thinking about how do we assign a cost to turnover? That's what I was thinking about when I was reading this paper. Like every time somebody leaves our organization, how much does that cost us? And then when we have to replace that person, what is our cost for new talent recruitment, onboarding, selection, things like that. And so I think for me, assigning some kind of cost benefit analysis to that will help me when I'm trying to make the argument that we need to study diversity climate in my organization and then make some investments to make sure that we keep that at a high level and make sure that it's symmetric. I think the other thing I think about when I read this paper is this, diversity climate asymmetry. Again, where somebody may be high, somebody might be low, but if you look at the average, it might be okay, but that kind of masks what's really going on at the unit level.
Good job. Yeah. So let's go to AK then, and get your perspective on, exactly what you think your answers are, right? So we've identified these important questions. We've clarified, what's missing from this literature. And so now you've stepped into this with your co-authors on this paper. Give us your answers. What exactly have you found?
Yeah, well, number one, acknowledge the importance of the distinction between trust and diversity climate perceptions, but acknowledge the importance of building both trust and diversity climate perceptions, particularly in units that already have unsupportive diversity climate in general to begin with. Like if you think about the organization, a lot of the organizations that are implementing initiatives, some of them are organizations where they've had to call in the EEOC. And so they're sort of forced. And so those are the companies that need these to work the most, but they're also the companies that might struggle with them the most if the trust isn't already there. And so in my mind, I mean, this just highlights that work needs to be done before you even begin the diversity initiative development process. Before you even start that, you have to work on trust building, or maybe, in tandem. But it was kind of eye-opening to see how powerful those effects were. It was something like, I think in unsupportive diversity climates, the relationships between trust and diversity climate at the individual level were 3 times stronger. So that blew my mind when I saw that. I was like, wow, I never get effects that strong. So, yeah.
All right, thank you. David, are there some additional things that you think this paper provides as answers to these questions?
Yeah, it certainly points out that it's important to look at individuals, right, within teams. And there's just one I was looking for a quote in the paper that's part of the discussion. And basically what AK and the authors write is the present study provides strong evidence that the relationship between diversity climate perceptions and trust was based on individuals' experiences relative to others within the department, right? And then I leave a little bit out, then basically it says, those effects demonstrate that irrespective of how unsupportive or supportive the overall department climate is, So that shows that it doesn't matter, again, like the team necessarily, what do people around you think, but also how can we make sure that we get everyone on board? How can we make sure that we don't leave individuals out so that they have particularly negative perception? Because if they do, it doesn't matter if everyone else is happy, right? We will see lower trust, we will see potentially then increased turnover and tensions and stuff like that. So I think this just emphasizes the importance to not leave people behind and really focus also on some of the individuals that might be less positive about the climate in their unit.
Okay, great. And, I tend to, we all see this stuff through our own lens, and I've done work on kind of what I call stakeholder influence capacity. And this is what some of this logic reminds me of too, is just kind of building, history matters and there's path dependence. And so you can't just suddenly create a great diversity program and say, we're now, supporting this if you don't have a history of being believable. It takes time for this sort of thing to sink in within an organization. But in that spirit of kind of broadening the approach of what is in this paper, Oscar, are there some answers in here to some additional questions?
Yes. I will just add for my colleagues that I think one of the things that this paper adds to the conversation is the complexity in which leaders need to approach these types of change initiatives, right? Because anytime you're dealing with diversity, equity, inclusion, typically you're thinking about organizational change initiatives. And so while AK and our co-authors have found trust as to be a reciprocal relationship, I think implicitly the understanding is, well, there's a lot of other things that are also probably have a reciprocal relationship, right, with diversity climate. And so you need to really think about this broadly in terms of what are the levers, what are the practices, what are the policies that we can actually bundle together, right, that can actually move our employees to a better place, to a higher level in terms of diversity climate. And so if you could just look at this paper and look at the complexity of the analyses that it took to empirically test this, like leaders should look at this, okay, well, this is not going to be a simple thing. And as a scholar, but also as an organizational consultant going into many of these organizations, people think it's an easy fix. Like if you just tell me this, do this one thing, then my problems will be solved. But this is a really complex issue that had many histories attached to it, not only the organizational history, right, but also cultural history, the country's history, things like that. And so leaders need to know that you have to have a multi-pronged approach when you're trying to initiate these diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. And also, if you don't see the results that you think you will receive, then it's not the time to just jettison and say it doesn't work. You need to go back to the table and say, well, maybe there are some other things that we didn't do correctly, or we may need to look at something else, as opposed to not like quickly just giving up and just say, throw our hands up, it's too hard, we can't do this. Because as AK and her co-authors did, they found a way to do this really hard, really complex, paper.
Yeah, and I think from the longitudinal aspect of AK, and I think you all mentioned in the paper the residual effects, where climate and trust at one point in time can still have impacts 2, 4, 6 years down the road. Can you speak to that also a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that surprised me as well. I mean, I hypothesized that there could be long-term effects, but we actually left it as a research question, not a hypothesis, just because nobody's tested over 6 years. So yeah, the relationship did get weaker over time, but it was still there. And at some point it plateaued. So in those last couple of years, it kind of flatlined, which suggests that it may even keep going beyond 6 years. So in the more supportive diversity climates, they got closer to zero. I think they at some point were no longer significant, but in the average in unsupportive diversity climates, they were absolutely still significant later on. In those unsupportive diversity climates, it absolutely plateaus and looks like it keeps going. So that's I wasn't sure whether to expect they would hang on that long, but they do. So and that's a little bit scary as an organizational leader. If you mess up in the very beginning, that can have an impact a decade.
Yes.
But the reverse of that, also, if you do things well in the beginning, the effects of that linger. So you can look at it in an optimistic sense as well.
Yeah, in my company, we're doing a lot of conversations around the employee value proposition. Like, how do we use DEI as really a talent attraction tool? And if we are using it as a tool and then we're bringing people in, what does it look like in the onboarding process to establish these positive perceptions of our diversity climate and trust? And if we can do that well in the beginning, does that have a higher baseline that can then have these residual positive effects on down the road? But if they have a bad experience very early in the onboarding process, then what impact does that have in commitment and turnover intentions?
Yeah, there's an amazing amount of stuff in this paper and a lot of other implications, and we'll draw those out a bit more in the last question too. But this next question that I've got up there is just, it's hard to imagine because there's just so damn much in this paper, and it is like at least a couple of papers in and of itself. But we do at least now have the benefit of hindsight, and there's always something. So let's go on to the question of what could be improved. Looking back on it, what could be also added to this paper or improved in some sort of way. So let's stick with Oscar and see what you think.
So I don't like this question, Mike. I admit I do not like it.
I'll forgive you whatever you say. I forgive you in advance.
No, because it was such a great paper, and we know all research has limitations, right? But so I would just say that it is a very unique sample, right? And so there were faculty members, and I do know there were staff members that were part of the original set, and that info is in the supplementary materials, and I do know some relationships didn't necessarily pan out. So the only thing I would say, I would love to see another study tested again in some way using professionals in another setting, because faculty members and academics are very, very specific group of people. And, so the possibility that some other jobs, I still believe the theoretical framework of, trust being reciprocal, diverse climate, and it can impact. But if I would pick anything, that would just be a little thing that I would say if we had some idea of other professions.
Yeah.
I agree. I was thinking about the aspect of tenure and turnover intentions in an environment of tenure. We just are such a unique setting for it. So I agree with Oscar.
One of y'all was reviewer too, weren't you?
Since you're already there, Anthony, anything else that you wanted to add? That's the primary thing you think could be done a bit better?
I think that was it. It's just the generalizability and just replicating, doing a constructive replication in a different setting.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. All right. And then David, time for you to be uncomfortable.
I'm not that uncomfortable because, as Oscar said, every paper has some limitations, and I think we just all have to be better at acknowledging these and being comfortable with limitations that we have, right? There's no perfect paper. So if you criticize something here, you can take any of my papers and criticize something about any of them, and probably have to agree with a lot of that. So that's just academic life, right? So I see that as like a chance to also move forward. So AK, I hope you see it similarly. But first of all, I fully agree with what Oscar and Anthony said. Like, obviously the tenure system is such a big confound potentially, right? Like, how likely are faculty members to turn over, particularly if they're embedded in later stages of their career in organizations. The second thing that I saw, and that's a bit of a criticism of the entire diversity climate literature, is that it's ultimately an attitudinal outcome, right? It's like turnover intentions, or not an attitude, but like what do I plan to do? I would love to see a paper on actual turnover, particularly given the whole tenure situation and everything, right? How many people do actually decide to leave the organizations? Does that mean giving up tenure? Does that mean going to other places? Yes or no? Turnover intention, of course, often can be a great outcome, but we just know from many diversity climate papers that have looked at things like job satisfaction, commitment, turnover intention, et cetera, versus actual performance outcomes, actual turnover outcomes, et cetera, and stuff like that. So I think that would be a second one that I think would be really interesting.
So may I just follow up to David's point, which, both of us, as we do research in this area, I totally agree with what David is saying, but I would just add that I think sometimes we downplay the attitudinal outcomes in our research, when in fact, it's really important. I would think it's really important for leaders to know if someone has some negative perceptions, because we do know that's impactful. So even if that person stay, your turnover rate may look good, but that person probably will engage in much more counterproductive work behaviors, right? Like they may not be positively giving things to this culture, right, or to the climate of your organization. So I hear the concern about attitudinal response, but at the same time, I think even with those attitudinal responses, we have enough theoretical work in our field that we can also point to. It could be a problem if they have this negative attitude and they're staying right in our organization. Like that could be a huge issue for us if they're staying as well.
Yeah,
I would
And I
say-
also had one more point, which is somewhat related to the sample, right? Anthony pointed out earlier that maybe people just want to leave their boss, right? And they want to move to a different department, unit, etc. That's also something that in a university setting is much harder to imagine, right? You're not going to be a professor in human resources and all of a sudden become a professor in English because you don't like your boss, right? So to some extent, again, like the generalizability there to other organizations where maybe it is easier to move into different departments. Maybe it's even part of the development plan of employees to make it to senior management levels that they are in different departments, different areas. I think that would be another thing. So I think just broadening this could provide additional insights.
Yeah, and then I was actually looking back at my notes. The other note that I had was just the racial diversity of the sample. It was almost 80% white. And so it's not necessarily reflective of the population in general, but in a lot of our social science research, I think that is also a limitation, that we just don't have enough racial diversity in the studies that we do.
Yeah, all excellent points. And that, of course, no single paper can cover everything, and that's not the intent either. But yeah, and it is just when people are watching this video, they may be junior, and they do need to keep that in mind, that even papers that have been all the way through this process, and something as exhaustive as even this paper is, there's lots of stuff that it didn't do. I remember one of my dissertation papers ended up getting published in a top journal, and then even won the best paper award for that journal. And then a few years later, doctoral students were reviewing it for a class, and they just ripped the hell out of it. I mean, and they were right. There's still a lot of stuff that isn't in there. So it's endemic to the profession that there's going to be things that aren't part of any given paper. But with that in mind, AK no doubt knows the limitations. In fact, she published a page and a half of them within the paper itself. So I'll reframe the question a little bit for you, and that is, if you had to do this all over again, and who in the hell would ever want to do that? But if you had to do this all over again, is there something that you would do differently?
That's hard to say. So I agree. The big flaw, and the reviewer saw as well, and that I agree with, is the sample. The demographic or lack of demographic diversity in the sample, and then its faculty. On one hand, it was good for testing the theory because it's a homogeneous group of people who interact within the same organizational structures, and so it's if you follow Schneider and Reicher's original climate etiology theory, faculty are perfect for this because they fit that. But on the other hand, we are so different from everyone else. And then we, in the beginning, we're looking at, doing the faculty sample with the staff sample, and they just have such different experience. It's two different worlds. It's absolutely two different worlds. And so, yeah, it's not even a hindsight thing. Like while we're doing this, we're like, yeah, who else does this apply to? It can apply to other fields, other organizations where you have this homogeneity, where you have some of the same characteristics, but still it needs to be tested in a lot of different samples. But it's so hard to get these data set. Like I couldn't go out and get this data set from another place. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to find that. So it's not a hindsight thing, like what could we have done differently. It's in the future, what miracle would I like to happen? I would like to get another data set that is just this big and just this long, and I would like to have it in a bunch of different industries with samples with different kinds of demographic diversity. That would be awesome. So if any corporate leaders out there are watching this video and you want me to come in and study your company, let me know.
I know a guy. I would say one other thing that we would be remiss not to mention is that at the time of this recording is February 2022, and every other day we send an article about the Great Resignation. And so I think your study is just so timely when we think about so many people who are leaving the workforce And so I don't know how you've thought about this, AK. How does this then inform the conversation that we're having around the great resignation, the great reshuffling, the great whatever that we're calling what we're in right now?
Yeah,
Why
I
don't
think
we just, we'll use that to segue. I'll just pop it up here real quick for sake of formality here, but I think that segs into the last question pretty well. So let's go with that. And it's just, it's not, we've moved beyond what can we do with the specific paper. I mean, and what happened with the paper was that the reason why it's such a contribution is because of the data set that allowed you to deal with questions that hadn't been adequately dealt with before. And that's the same limitation, the need for more data sets, which is going to make it even harder to do beyond that. But beyond just that particular niche that you've looked at within this paper, let's broaden out the idea and think about, as other people are watching this and maybe want to guide their research, what else should they be working on? And we'll start with what Anthony asked you. So we'll start with AK.
Okay, so in terms of the Great Resignation, I think, so in the paper, turnover intentions, the relationships with turnover intentions wasn't significant in most models, just in one of the models. I think we would see a much stronger impact today, maybe not among faculty, well, maybe among faculty, because I've known a bunch of people who have even left academia to go into industry. But in industry, yeah, I think the effect on turnover intentions would be even more powerful, because it's people's day-to-day experiences at work. So many people are saying, I'm not happy here. I don't trust my coworkers. I'm not happy with how they handle diversity stuff. I'm out. Right? They'll just they feel more empowered to leave than they did before. So that's one thing. In terms of, hold on, let me have this question right in front of me again. What else needs to be studied about? So different samples, clearly. Another thing is, y'all have mentioned before antecedents. So I know Oscar and David and Anthony are all really interested in HR initiatives. Those absolutely need to be studied, absolutely. But my works in progress are focusing more on the leader, because and this sort of popped up in some qualitative data I have from a study I started several years ago that's not on diversity climate, but diversity climate issues have popped up. And there are people who say, well, I've had a wonderful experience here. They're in a situation in which HR initiatives would be helpful for them. They say, I've had a wonderful experience. We don't have programs, procedures, etc. But my supervisor is just so understanding. That person gets it. And so they have a wonderful experience there. And then there are other people that I have in the sample who say, well, we have all these HR initiatives, all these programs, processes, and procedures, but my supervisor just doesn't get it. They don't do it right. They're not implementing it fairly. They're pretending they don't exist. They don't let us know they exist, so we're not even aware of them. And so here, it's not, the HR initiatives aren't irrelevant, but there's this strong impact that the supervisor has. And so that's something that I'm looking on in my current work, is the effect of the unit supervisor on diversity climate perceptions. But that's not to say that the HR, and y'all keep on studying that. Absolutely, that's absolutely critical. But we absolutely need more research on how do you build positive diversity climates.
Excellent. So David, when you get that next request to review a paper or whatever, what do you want to see that paper be about in this area?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with AK more in terms of antecedents of diversity climate. I mean, that has been a big point that we pointed out in the literature before. There's just not a lot of stuff out there. People talk about it as if there is, but if you actually look at the empirical research, it's quite limited. And I think that really holds us back and holds also our impact on practice back, right? Because that's, as Anthony pointed out at the very beginning, that's what they care about ultimately, right? What do we do? How do we now change it? Two things, one a little far field, but also connecting to a comment that we had, and one that actually ties to what AK said. Diversity climate research has been dominated by a quantitative approach, right? So I'm a quantitative scholar as well, so I totally get it. Recently, I've done a little more qualitative work or started some projects on this. And I think that's really an area in which diversity climate could go as well, right? Like some of these things, like, yes, maybe we're able to collect these amazing data sets as we have in this paper here, but that's rare that you have the opportunity to do that, right? But maybe you can get at some of the things through interviews, right? Through talking to individuals in teams, understanding their processes. What does it matter how the team feels relative to how they feel themselves, right? How do things change maybe over time, those things. So I think qualitative research certainly offers an avenue in which we can address some of the questions here that were posted also by this paper. And the second one, also somewhat related to a comment, right? It is 2022. So we have been living through a pandemic for like quite a while now. And that's something that I was really interested in. What happens in remote work, right? What happens, we're talking here about social constructs, about like a shared understanding of how things are being done in our teams, of how does the leader or the supervisor behave? What do my coworkers think? How do they behave? Like, are people even aware of that anymore, right? Like, to what extent does the remote aspect of the work allow us to even form like joint perceptions of a climate or something in a team? How can we understand these things? So that's just, again, a little more out there, but I do think that's something that just in many other research areas that had to kind of grapple with this completely changed world of work in some way that will, I'm sure, will to some extent at least stay with us, right? More people will want to work remotely, and more people will probably work remotely. To what extent does that influence these things? And what can leaders do to still try to create coherent perceptions within teams, within units, to make sure that there's this shared understanding, right? So I think that's really a big one that ties into some of the prior things that we talked about as well.
Yeah, that's really intriguing. Do you zoom in on diversity? Do you zoom out? I mean, what is all the zooming doing to this whole issue as well? But Oscar, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I agree with my colleagues, the perspective they shared. I would just add that, we talked about antecedents before, and my colleagues have brought that up again. I will phrase it a little bit differently in terms of what I think much more work needs to do, and that's around interventions, right? So, and typically when we study interventions in the literature, we typically only look at like one intervention at a time. But I would love to see robust research in the area, look at multiple interventions that can be tested to see how they work together, and how they, the impact that they have, not only on leaders, but also on colleagues as well, right? Because it could be the case where I may have a horrible leader, but my colleague, is a buffer in some type of way that makes my perception to be much different than what it could be, right? And so again, this is a place where it's really hard a lot of times to publish this intervention research in top journals, particularly if you want to study it in a robust way with multiple types of interventions. But I think we definitely need, this part of the literature, because if not, we are just, one of the papers, I think it's Dobbins' paper, was like best practices or best guesses, right? And so I don't think we admit how much we guess in the field, right? Because we just don't have a lot of empirical tests for these things, and that's a limitation I think we need to deal with in the field.
Yeah, fair enough.
I
Anthony,
like.
oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I wanted to kind of build on something David said. I know at the root of diversity climate, that the construct, we assume that it's a shared perception, right? But in the build up to the paper, AK, you acknowledge that oftentimes that perception is not shared. So I would love to see more research looking at diversity climate asymmetry. Part of my research looks at conflict asymmetry. For years, we assumed that in a team setting, that perceptions of conflict are shared equally amongst people, but we realize that that's an unreasonable assumption. So looking at diversity climate asymmetry as the construct, and maybe looking at the standard deviation as the way we operationalize it, instead of aggregating and taking the mean and using that as the construct. I think there may be some value looking at that asymmetry and then looking at its correlates in organizations.
Yeah,
And
great.
Max Reinwald is doing some work in that area. And I think, David, are you doing a little bit of that too? I've got some theory pieces on it that keep getting rejected. I'm trying to publish on that, trying very hard.
Anthony, do you think, is there any specific research that would help more so in making the business case or any other case within organizations?
When I look at our colleagues in marketing, they look at things like the customer. customer growth, customer retention, things like that. So when I think about the conversations I would have with my leaders, they would want to know, I work for a bank. And so you think about all these different bank branches. Every one of our bank branches probably have its own unique diversity climate. How does that diversity climate at each bank then drive loan growth, deposits, things that are much more customer facing, in addition to just retention and, employee satisfaction within that branch. So I would love to see at my company just a branch level view of this, and then tying it to these other financially focused performance outcomes.
Mhm. All right.
Yeah, I think marketing probably has some good unique perspectives that we would do well to kind of blend together.
Mhm.
Patrick McKay and Derek Avery, their work, who are my co-authors, they did some phenomenal diversity climate work, and they looked at JCPenney stores, right? And so I think they gave it's a good corollary, right, to think about the different climates in each of these stores and how they impact the customers in that case. So I will just point to that research on that. That will be similar to Anthony's question. Yeah.
We have covered all of my questions, and very exhaustively, very extensively. We covered a lot of ground. Is there anything else that you guys want, while we've got everybody gathered here, anything else you guys want to discuss or ask of each other?
I just want to say thanks for picking this paper. Yeah, I feel honored you chose this one. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
No,
And
it's a pleasure.
thanks
Yeah.
to all y'all for agreeing to jump in on this.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I'm glad we got this to come together, and appreciate your time and attention. And we'll close out the recording here. Let me see if I can figure out how to do that.